On the night of the taping, everyone laughed. Jack Benny walked onto that stage the way he had walked onto stages for 50 years. Slow, deliberate, with a timing so perfect it could break your heart. He told his jokes. He played the miser. He pretended, as he always pretended, to be 39 years old. The audience roared. Dean Martin laughed from the podium. Lucille Ball wiped tears from her eyes. The good kind. The kind that come from laughing too hard. Nobody knew. Nobody knew that Jack Benny had just been told his body was full of cancer. Nobody knew that in a few weeks he would slip into a coma in his own home, surrounded by friends who couldn't save him. Nobody knew that this night, this roast, this room full of laughter would be the last time America ever saw him perform. The taping was in late 1974. Jack Benny died on December 26th, the day after Christmas. The show aired on February 7th, 1975, 6 weeks after they buried him. And Dean Martin, who had hosted that night of laughter, had to sit in an editing room and watch his dead friend tell jokes. Had to record a new introduction, dedicating the broadcast to Jack's memory. Had to smile for the cameras while carrying something no camera could see. This is the story of that night. Not as the audience saw it, not as the television broadcast showed it, but as the people who were there remembered it. The stagehands, the producers, the friends who didn't know they were saying goodbye. Some of what follows is fact. Some is the kind of truth that lives in the spaces between facts. In a glance held too long, a joke that landed differently in hindsight. The terrible weight of laughter that becomes grief. This is not a documentary. This is a love letter written too late. And like all love letters written too late, it begins with someone who didn't know he was already gone. Late 1974, NBC Studios, Burbank, California. The Dean Martin Celebrity Roast was, by 1974, an American institution. Every few months, Dean would gather the biggest names in show business, sit them at a long table, and let them insult each other for an hour. It was vaudeville dressed up for television. It was a bar fight with better lighting, and audiences loved it. The formula was simple. Pick someone famous. Invite their friends. Let the jokes fly. Tonight, the target was Lucille Ball. Lucy, the most beloved woman in American comedy, the queen of television. The redhead who had made a nation laugh for 20 years and showed no signs of stopping. The guest list was a who's who of Hollywood royalty. Bob Hope, Milton Berle, Don Rickles, Ginger Rogers, Henry Fonda, Vivian Vance, Lucy's partner from the old days, and Jack Benny. Of course, Jack Benny. You couldn't roast Lucy without Jack. They went back decades, radio days, television days, the golden age when comedy meant something and the people who made it were giants. Jack had confirmed weeks ago. He wouldn't miss it for the world. Dean Martin arrived at the studio around 4 in the afternoon. This was early for Dean. He was famous for his lack of rehearsal, his refusal to prepare, his insistence that everything be loose and easy and unrehearsed. But the roasts were different. The roasts required coordination, timing the jokes, arranging the order of speakers, making sure the chemistry worked. Dean walked through the backstage area, nodding at crew members he'd known for years. He stopped at his dressing room, poured himself a drink, and looked at the rundown for the evening. Lucy was the guest of honor. That meant she'd sit at the center of the dais, enduring an hour of affectionate abuse before getting the last word. Dean would open. He always opened. A few jokes about Lucy, a few jokes about himself, then hand it off to the first roaster. The list of speakers was long. Milton Berle would go hard. He always did. Don Rickles would be savage and somehow lovable. Bob Hope would be smooth, professional, armed with writers who knew exactly how far to push. And Jack Benny was scheduled somewhere in the middle. Dean looked at Jack's name on the list. He thought about calling him, checking in. They'd known each other for 30 years. Not best friends, exactly. Dean didn't really do best friends, but something close. Fellow travelers on the same road. Men who understood what it cost to make people laugh for a living. He didn't call. He'd see Jack tonight. There would be time. There was always time. Jack Benny arrived late. This was unusual. Jack was famously punctual. A man who believed that being late was a form of theft, stealing time from people who had trusted you with it. But today, he was late. A production assistant who worked that taping remembered seeing him come through the stage door. She said he looked tired, not sick. Exactly. Jack always looked a little fragile, a little older than his years. But something was different. He moved slower, she recalled, like he was carrying something heavy. But when he saw the other performers, when he started talking, he lit up. He was Jack Benny again. You forgot he'd looked tired. You forgot everything except how funny he was. Jack made his way to the green room, shaking hands, trading jokes, slipping into the rhythm of the evening. He found Dean by the bar. "Dino," Jack said. It was what he always called him. "You look terrible." Dean grinned. "You look worse." "Impossible. I'm 39. You've been 39 for 40 years. And I'll be 39 for 40 more." They clinked glasses. Dean studied his friend's face. Something was off. The color, maybe. The way Jack held himself, like he was bracing against something invisible. "You okay?" Dean asked. Jack's smile didn't waver. "I'm always okay," he said. "I'm Jack Benny." Dean let it go. He shouldn't have. 6:30 p.m. The stage. The audience filed in. 400 people dressed in their best, ready for an evening of comedy royalty. The set was the standard roast configuration. A long curved dais, microphone at center stage, Dean's podium off to the side. Behind them a backdrop with Lucy's name in lights. Lucy took her seat at the center, flanked by the evening's roasters. She was 63 years old, still vibrant, still sharp, still the woman who had revolutionized television comedy. Jack Benny sat 3 chairs down from her. He was smiling. He was always smiling. But a cameraman who worked that show remembered something. He said Jack kept touching his stomach. Small movements, almost invisible, like something hurt, and he was trying to hide it. The cameraman didn't think much of it at the time. Later, he thought about it constantly. Taping begins. Taping begins. Dean walked to the podium. The audience applauded. Dean raised his hand, the signature glass of bourbon catching the light, and waited for the noise to die down. "Welcome to the Dean Martin Celebrity Roast," he said. "Tonight we honor a woman who has made America laugh for 20 years. A woman who can do anything. Sing, dance, get laughs, especially from her singing and dancing. Laughter. Lucille Ball is the most beloved woman in show business, and I mean that sincerely. I have to. She knows where I live." More laughter. Dean glanced down the dais at Jack. Their eyes met. Jack gave him a small nod, the kind of acknowledgement that passes between old friends, wordless and complete. Dean turned back to the audience. "We've got a hell of a lineup tonight. Bob Hope is here, Milton Berle, Don Rickles, who I'm legally required to mention, is an acquired taste, and of course the great Jack Benny, who claims to be 39 years old. Jack, I've seen your birth certificate. It's in Latin." Jack laughed. The audience laughed. The show was underway. The roasters came one by one. Milton Berle was savage, as expected. Don Rickles was a controlled explosion, insulting everyone in the room while somehow making them love him for it. Ginger Rogers was elegant. Bob Hope was smooth. And then it was Jack Benny's turn. He rose from his seat slowly. That famous slow walk, the timing that had made him a legend. He approached the microphone with the unhurried confidence of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. The audience applauded before he said a word. Jack waited. This was his gift. The pause. The silence that somehow became funnier than any joke. He stood at the microphone, looked at Lucy, looked at Dean, looked at the audience. He waited and waited. The laughter started to build, nervous at first, then genuine. Jack Benny was doing what Jack Benny always did, making comedy out of nothing, out of pure anticipation. Then he spoke. "Lucy," he said, "I've known you for a very long time." Simple words. But something in his voice made the room go quiet. "I've known you since radio, since the days when we didn't know if this whole entertainment thing was going to work out, since before either of us had gray hair. Though you've hidden yours better than I've hidden mine." Lucy smiled. There was something in her eyes, a recognition maybe, that this wasn't just a roast. This was something else. "You've made more people laugh than anyone I know," Jack continued. "You've done it for 30 years, and you've done it with grace, and I want you to know something." He paused. That famous pause. "You're still not as funny as me." The room exploded. Jack held the moment, milking it. letting the laughter wash over him like something he needed to survive. Then he softened. "But you're close," he said. "You're very close. And I'm proud to call you my friend." Lucy was crying now. Not the fake tears of television, but something real. She mouthed, "I love you," across the stage. Jack smiled. "I love you too," he said. "Now let's get back to the insults." The rest of Jack's set was classic Benny. The self-deprecating humor, the violin jokes, the 39-years-old routine that never got old, no matter how many times he did it. But a sound technician who worked that night remembered something strange. Between jokes, the technician said, when the audience was laughing and he didn't have to perform, his face would change. Just for a second. Like he was somewhere else. Like he was saying goodbye to something. The technician didn't know what it meant. He learned 6 weeks later, 9:30 p.m., the taping ends. The show wrapped with Lucy's response. Gracious, funny, everything a finale should be. The audience gave a standing ovation. The performers hugged and congratulated each other. Dean found Jack backstage. "Hell of a set," Dean said. Jack was sitting in a chair, catching his breath. He looked exhausted, the kind of tired that sleep doesn't fix. "Thanks, Dino. You sure you're okay?" Jack looked up at him. For a moment the mask slipped. For a moment Jack Benny looked like what he was, an 80-year-old man carrying something too heavy to name. "I'm fine," Jack said. "Just tired. Long day." Dean wanted to push. Wanted to ask what was really going on. Wanted to sit down and have a real conversation. The kind they'd never quite managed in 30 years of friendship. But someone called his name. There were producers to thank, sponsors to schmooze, the endless machinery of television that demanded attention. "Get some rest," Dean said. "I'll call you next week." "Sure," Jack said. "Next week." Dean walked away. He didn't look back. December 1974. The weeks after the taping passed quickly. Dean was busy. He was always busy. More tapings, more shows, the endless churn of celebrity that left no room for stillness. He kept meaning to call Jack, kept meaning to check in, but something always came up. Then, in early December, the phone rang. It was George Burns, Jack's oldest friend. His voice was wrong. "Jack's sick," George said. "It's bad." Dean sat down. "How bad?" "Cancer. Pancreas, they say." George's voice broke. "They say it's everywhere." Dean didn't speak. The room felt suddenly airless, the silence pressing in from all sides. "Can I see him?" Dean finally asked. "He's at home. He's still Jack. For now. But you should come soon, Dino. You should come while there's still time." Dean went to Jack's house 3 days later. The house in Holmby Hills was quiet. Too quiet for a home that had hosted so much laughter over the years. A nurse met Dean at the door and led him to the living room, where Jack sat in a chair by the window. He looked smaller. That was the first thing Dean noticed. Jack Benny, who had seemed larger than life on every stage he'd ever graced, looked somehow diminished, as if the sickness was already erasing him, piece by piece. But when Jack saw Dean, he smiled. "Dino," he said, "you look terrible." Dean tried to laugh. It came out wrong. "You look worse." "Impossible. I'm 39. The old routine. The familiar words. But this time, they hung in the air differently, heavy with something neither man could say. Dean sat down across from his friend. "I saw the rough cut of the roast," he said. "Your set was perfect. Best of the night." Jack waved a hand. "Lucy was the star. I was just glad to be there." "Jack, don't." Jack's voice was gentle but firm. "Don't do the thing where we talk about it. I've done enough of that. George was here yesterday crying like a baby. Bob came by this morning. Everyone wants to have the big moment, the meaningful conversation." He shook his head. "I just want to be Jack Benny for a little while longer. Can you do that for me, Dino? Can you just let me be funny?" Dean looked at his friend. He thought about all the years they'd known each other. All the shows, the parties, the late nights in Vegas when the world seemed like it would never end. He thought about the things they'd never said, the gratitude, the respect, the love that men of their generation buried under jokes and handshakes. "Sure," Dean said. "Tell me a joke." Jack smiled. A man walks into a bar with a violin. December 2020, 1974. Jack Benny slipped into a coma at his home. Over the next 4 days, a parade of friends came to say goodbye. George Burns sat by his bed for hours, holding his hand. Frank Sinatra came, and Bob Hope and Johnny Carson. Governor Ronald Reagan visited, an old friend from the Hollywood days. Jack never woke up. He died on December 26th, the day after Christmas. He was 80 years old. At his funeral, George Burns tried to deliver the eulogy. He stood at the podium, looked out at the 1,800 people who had come to mourn, and broke down. He couldn't continue. The words wouldn't come. Bob Hope rose and took his place. For a man who was the undisputed master of comedic timing, Hope said, his voice unsteady, "You would have to say this is the only time when Jack Benny's timing was all wrong. He left us much too soon." Dean Martin sat in the front row. He didn't cry. He had learned long ago how to hold grief inside, how to keep it hidden behind the mask he'd worn for 40 years. But his hands were shaking. And in his pocket, he carried a photograph, a snapshot from the roast, just a few weeks old. Jack Benny at the microphone, laughing, alive, telling jokes to an audience that didn't know they were watching him for the last time. February 7th, 1975. The broadcast date arrived. 6 weeks after Jack Benny's death, NBC aired the Dean Martin celebrity roast, Lucille Ball. America would finally see what had been taped in that studio. The jokes, the laughter, the tributes. They would see Jack Benny perform. They would see a dead man make them laugh. The network had asked Dean to record a new introduction, something to acknowledge what had happened, something to frame the broadcast as a tribute, rather than just entertainment. Dean sat in a studio, alone, a single camera pointed at his face. He looked tired. The holidays had been hard. The funeral had been harder. And now this. The strange, impossible task of introducing a show where his friend was still alive, still funny, still Jack Benny. The director gave him the signal. Dean looked into the camera. "Before we begin tonight," he said, "I want to say something about Jack Benny." He paused. The pause Jack had taught him. The silence that means more than words. Jack was one of the great ones, a genius of comedy, a master of timing, and one of the finest men I ever knew. His voice caught, almost imperceptibly. But it caught. What you're about to see was taped before Jack passed away. He didn't know it would be his last performance. None of us did. But watching it back, I think maybe part of him knew. I think maybe he was saying goodbye, in his own way. Dean took a breath. This broadcast is dedicated to the memory of Jack Benny, my friend, our friend, the man who made us laugh for 50 years and never asked for anything in return except that we laugh a little longer. He tried to smile. "Jack, wherever you are, and knowing you negotiated a good spot. This one's for you." The show aired. Millions of Americans watched Jack Benny walk to that microphone one last time. They heard him tell his jokes, saw him do his pauses, watched him make Lucille Ball cry with laughter and love. They didn't know they were watching a ghost. But Dean knew. He watched from his living room in Beverly Hills, a glass of bourbon in his hand, the television flickering in the darkness. He watched Jack say, "I've known you for a very long time." He watched Jack say, "You've made more people laugh than anyone I know." He watched Jack say, "I love you too." And when the broadcast ended, when the credits rolled and the screen went dark, Dean sat in the silence for a long time. He thought about the last time he'd seen Jack. That day at the house when Jack asked him not to be serious, not to have the big moment. "Just let me be funny," Jack had said. Dean had let him be funny, and now Jack was gone, and all that remained was the laughter trapped in tape, preserved forever, a voice from the other side of something final. Christmas Day, 1995, 20 years later. Dean Martin died in his sleep. He was 78 years old. The official cause was respiratory failure, but the people who knew him said it was something else. They said he'd been dying slowly since his son's plane crash in 1987. They said the last 8 years had been a long, slow fade. But there was another death he carried too. The people who cleaned out his house found many things: photographs, memorabilia, the accumulated evidence of a life lived in the spotlight. And in a desk drawer, they found a photograph. It was from the Lucille Ball roast, December 1974. Jack Benny at the microphone, caught mid-joke. His face lit up with the particular joy of a performer doing what he was born to do. On the back of the photograph, in Dean's handwriting, 2 words: last laugh. Some nights stay with you, not because of the applause, not because of the ratings, but because of what happened in the silence afterward. On a night in late 1974, 3 friends stood on a stage and made America laugh. One of them was already dying. None of them knew it. The cameras captured the jokes. The tape preserved the laughter. The broadcast went out to millions. But what the cameras couldn't capture, what no tape could preserve, was the weight of what was coming. The grief that would follow, the empty chair at every gathering afterward, the phone calls that would never be made again. Jack Benny spent 50 years making people laugh. His last performance was a gift he didn't know he was giving. And Dean Martin, the man who seemed to care about nothing, who wore his indifference like armor, carried that gift for the rest of his life. He never talked about it. But he never forgot. George Burns lived to be 100 years old. He never stopped missing Jack. In interviews, even decades later, he would tear up at the mention of his friend's name. They had known each other for 60 years, and George said the loss never got easier. The thing about Jack, George said once, was that he made you feel like you were the funniest person in the room, even when he was the one telling the jokes. He had that gift. He made everyone around him better. He paused. I've lived a long time. I've buried a lot of friends. But Jack was the one that broke something in me. Something that never quite healed. Lucille Ball died in 1989. She was 77. A heart attack, sudden and final. At her memorial, someone played a clip from the roast, Jack Benny's segment, the part where he told her he was proud to call her his friend. The room wept, not because Jack was dead, not because Lucy was dead, but because they were watching something that could never exist again. 3 people who loved each other, laughing together, unaware of the darkness waiting just beyond the light. Here is what remains: a broadcast, preserved in archives. A dead man telling jokes to an audience that didn't know they were watching history. A dedication, recorded in grief. Dean Martin's voice, steady and breaking, honoring a friend who had already gone. A photograph, found in a drawer. Jack Benny at the microphone, frozen in the last laugh he would ever give. And somewhere, in the space between memory and forgetting, the echo of what might have been said, the gratitude never spoken, the love never declared, the goodbye that came too late. Some nights stay with you forever, not because of what happened, but because of what didn't. Dean Martin spent 30 years calling Jack Benny his friend. They traded jokes, shared stages, orbited each other's lives like planets around the same sun, but they never had the conversation. Never sat down and said the things that mattered. Never broke through the armor both of them wore. And then Jack was gone, and the conversation would never happen. That's the cruelest joke of all, not death itself. We all know death is coming, but the silence we leave behind, the words we meant to say, the calls we meant to make. I'll call you next week, Dean had said. He never did. On February 7th, 1975, America watched Jack Benny perform one last time. They laughed. They always laughed. And somewhere, in a living room in Beverly Hills, Dean Martin raised a glass to the television screen. Here's to you, Jack, he said to the empty room. Here's to the last laugh.